this? All right, welcome to, this is our fourth class. It's the 10th of June, and we are diving in deeper to some concepts that you guys have been learning about in your e-learning modules and discussing in your discussions, and then writing different assignments about it. So we have a kind of a smattering of different things we're going to discuss today. I'm going to give you an alternate framework to look at different leadership styles, something that I've used and reflected on with friends. We're going to talk about legacy and landscapes, looking at maybe what our vision is, and through that vision, what we'll leave behind, and look at the landscape of a couple different types of leaders. Continuing a little bit of our conversation from last week. We're gonna have a discussion on what is right and wrong using ethical scenarios. And I have actually a clip from a friend who will help us figure out that first scenario that you guys all did a really great job of thinking through in your ethical scenario assignment. We'll talk about what integrity means with an example of a bridge collapse nearby my hometown in Minnesota, or a town I lived in for 7 years. It's not necessarily my hometown, but anyway, efficiency. Someone brought up this phrase, killing two birds with one stone, so we'll discuss that. And then look at conflict styles with different types of birds. And then finally, look at restoration. So all this kind of cycles together in a very cyclical way, as does the history of our Earth, which I think is cool as well. That's why I put that there. So let's take a look at different leadership styles. Actually, I want to go way back to when we started. Let's look over the landscape of different types of leaders. So last time we talked about our leaders focused on individuals or the success of the whole. And now we have some vocabulary about servant leadership. Does anyone want to define what servant leadership is? Who's got a definition here? What does it mean to be a servant leader?
Servant leadership is like the whole purpose is to serve others.
Totally. Yeah, awesome. And so what kind of qualities then would you maybe have as a leader if you were a servant leader?
I would also add that servant leaders, they work towards the greater good.
Yeah, totally.
Very, as far as like the characteristics, qualities, they're empathetic and they like to focus on leading
I don't know if this is my...
getting them to where they're at.
Mm-hmm. I think your microphone went in and out, but from what I could hear from what you were saying is I'm not as lost as you think. Oh, interesting. Okay. So yeah, getting back on track, looking out, having empathy for the whole group, working towards the common good. Does that seem to summarize what you said? And okay, so then last week when we looked at this, or last class when we looked at this, we saw that a leadership style may be more focused on the individual, has a little bit more ego involved, versus eco would put us in relationship with the rest of the world. And so, and the rest of the different people that we're leading, or maybe just in a group. And so I wanted to bring up this idea of hierarchical, something that's in a hierarchy. Are all leadership styles hierarchical? And I want you to maybe from your let's see, different types of leaders, right? We have different types of leaders: authoritarian, democratic, paternalistic, laissez-faire, transactional, and transformational. Which one of those are hierarchical and which ones are not? And then let's just go ahead and so start. You can think about that, but then I want you to just list as many world or national leaders that you can think of. I actually wanna. So go ahead and just start listing world leaders that you can think of in the chat box. And awesome, yeah. Authoritarian, definitely hierarchical. Do this. Okay, awesome. So let's have everybody submit at least one world leader that they can think of. World leader, national leader, like that. Yeah, and Gabby, I would agree. Any government system full of leaders is a hierarchy. Do you guys not know of any? I mean, you could list like who's the president of the United States. That would be one. Okay, cool. Awesome. Cool. And so if I give you a picture here, there's this is actually comes from an article that I read that was why do we oftentimes divert to authoritarian leaders? Like you guys are saying, authoritarian leaders are oftentimes hierarchical, which would be the oppositeness of a servant leader. And so, you know, can you think of why are we in a situation right now where we have a lot of authoritarian leaders? Hey, Coyote, come here. Come here. She'll sit quietly all day, and then I go to teach this class, and she's like, "Ooh, working." Okay, so let's see. Does anyone have a thought about that? Why are we in a situation where we have a lot of authoritarian leaders? Someone who says, "This is what I think. Follow me." They're also sometimes described as having a zero sum versus a non-zero sum. So I had to look this one up, but a zero sum is if we cooperate, we can both win. But they're pulling towards opposite directions. And so that would be like there's a winner and a loser. But if you had a non-zero sum, that would be like you're adding up your effect together. And so two people pulling on the same side of a tug of war equals then two winners instead of one leader or one right way of doing it. Yeah, but oftentimes, for sure, Gabby, authoritarian or hierarchical leaders show the people that they're in control and there's a proper way to do things. Kind of getting back to like the purpose of confidence or competence. And then, yeah, if we look around the world, maybe we think, is there a reason why these different countries and cultures do things differently? I'm just going to let that one seat for you guys. Well, I guess, yeah, do we have any thoughts? Like, is there one way to make it better? Does that always make it better to have things always be done differently? Okay. So yeah, so think about that. That might be something I ask you within a one-on-one conversation. And because I know me and Gabby talked about that, different people from different countries and how different cultures would allow people to work in different ways, right? Maybe um, like based on the history, does anyone know the history of like South African apartheid? Basically, people came in and people from Belgium uh, and the Netherlands, so most of the Netherlands came to South Africa and basically colonized and put the people who used to live there, the native people, into camps, and they gave them different laws, not so much different than you would say what happened with slavery in the United States too. So sometimes those cultural holdovers actually show up then later on in the government. Venezuela is known for having a lot of potentially really corrupt leaders that oftentimes took advantage of the natural resources within oil, and then created quite a big gap in power, basically, in money distribution within the country. Okay, and so that gets to the point of like liberty. I think this is kind of interesting, broadly speaking. Liberty is the ability to do as one pleases, or a right or immunity enjoyed by prescription or by a grant. So this kind of seems very clinical, right? Immunity enjoyed by a prescription. So if you have a liberty to do something, you have a freedom or a right. I asked a friend this question yesterday, but do you think, if you had to list two basic human rights, what would you describe those as? I'll be right back. Yeah, totally. Freedom of speech. And we have examples across the globe, though, of places where freedom of speech isn't one of the rights that's determined on. So this kind of gets to our question of ethics, which is a little bit interesting. Basically, how do we determine what is right and what is wrong? Like, what is a right? What is a right that we have, and how do we all agree upon that? So in the United States, what's the original document that would have decided on what is right and what is wrong? Yeah, exactly, the Constitution. So there you had a lot of people coming together. I'm going to skip around here. I have all these slides all the time, but I never know kind of what order they're going to go in. So you had a bunch of people who wanted to make a decision on what was right and what was wrong. And I want to give you another example of people who meet in this sort of way. They talk about this a lot in the Servant Leadership book that I'm referencing. But this Quaker way of consensus or unity decision making. So during the meeting, they always start with a brief moment of silence. And then there's usually an appointed clerk or someone whose whole focus isn't just to keep the meeting running, but is to like sense in on the meeting and figure out how it's going. Which, when you think of like potentially if this is a meeting, we have silence because sometimes you guys just chat and don't talk. And then there is no real appointed clerk but that would be kind of a cool thing to have, right? It's sort of hard to gauge how the class is going when I can't see any of your faces. Or like I'm not interacting with you or anything like that, right? So that makes it hard to have any sort of real feeling of a group in this way. But then they would also sit in a circle or square so people could see each other and be aware of each other. No single person is raised in status above the others. And that, again, that is a note to this non-hierarchical way of leadership. And they also don't, in contrast to the United States, government. There's no official like creed or anything to this particular religion. And instead they have these common values, which we've talked about: peace, integrity, humility, and community. And they don't necessarily believe that there's sins, but that all humans are inherently good. So anyway, I was just researching more about the Quakers, and I thought this was a cool way to think about consensus-making leadership. I also had another person I was talking to who was describing an intentional living community. Have you guys ever heard of this or thought of this? Like people who live within community purposely. And I guess all of that kind of was sort of my shady way of saying I really would appreciate if you guys turned your cameras on. I think it creates for me a sort of, yeah, I know that was kind of low, but it's hard for me if I can't see your faces. I just don't enjoy it that much. It's hard for me, but also I guess like in this consensus building scene, if someone were to build a good reason and we would all come to a consensus as to why we should leave our cameras off, I would be okay with that, I suppose, as well. And I suppose we're abiding by silence right now. Oh, no worries, Ezra. Yeah. Cool. Oh, that is fine. That is fine. It's kind of cool to know like how how do you show up is part of it, right? So like being in online school is sort of interesting because everything's conducted from your house, but we'll talk about professionalism too within ethics. How much do aesthetics go into professionalism? Like how you look or how people perceive you? It's kind of an interesting question. Okay, so I want to back up a little bit, just kind of dove in here, but let's go back to this, which is, okay, well, hold on. Where do we want to go? Yeah, I guess different styles of leaders. So we just talked about authoritarian leaders. Here is another example of a leader, Boris Johnson. This is I don't know, he's known for brashness, bending the truth, and bad hair, which to me are not necessarily great traits. I mean, the hair, like I'm saying with aesthetics, maybe doesn't matter so much, like maybe it shouldn't matter exactly how we look. I feel like sometimes there's a double standard too between like what men look like and what women look like. Bringing up sort of like there was always a lot of criticism towards what Hillary Clinton was wearing and what her hair looked like. And I thought that was always felt a little bit unfair, unbiased. But here's a leader who has a do or die sort of mindset about things, like do it or don't. And also is into stunts and one time got stuck up here, which I thought was kind of interesting. And sometimes that do or die or that like uninhibited confidence can lead to potentially some unethical practices, right? So we'll talk about ethics in a minute here. So I feel like I'm getting ahead of myself, but this was a little bit from last week. Does anyone know what these two men are pointing at or who these two men are? Totally, Ezra. So this is DNA. This is photograph 51. It is one of the, it's the first photograph of DNA. And by this, these two men were able to figure out, and they got the Nobel Peace Prize, or the Nobel Prize for arranging the shape of DNA in this way. And so this is Francis Crick and James Watson. And you might know their names. You might also know her name. she was the one who actually took this photograph. And she was very hardworking and dedicated and humble in creating this photograph. It took her about 62 hours just to take this one photograph, and countless numbers of hours engineering the best way to do it. So through trial and error, through a lot of time behind an X-ray machine, which it's hard to know whether or not this was the case, but she ultimately died very early from ovarian cancer. And we know now the relationship between X-rays and radiation and cancer. So, so she died, and these two men, without her permission, used this photograph while she was still alive without consulting her, asking her, or giving her a spot at the table or in the circle, if you're thinking like a Quaker, right? And you know, it's kind of funny too, because confidence and competence, they didn't even know enough about chemistry to know that something that's hydrophobic would be hidden on the inside, something that hates water, hydrophobic, fearing water would be on the inside. And Rosalind Franklin, as a chemist and a master of her trade, did know that, and so she definitely fought for having those bases on the outside, on the inside, and the sugar phosphate on the outside. I don't know how many of you guys have taken biology, but that this is a pretty big moment for us for being able to see what our DNA is made out of. And so then you look at these two different leadership styles, right? And you have, there's physiological differences potentially, you might wonder, between a male brain and a female brain. And so on the left here is a male brain, and on the right is a female brain. And I want to just zoom in particularly on, if you can direct your line of focus to this one and this one. Can you see any differences here between the left and the right? And this one will become interesting in a second here.
I think that it almost seems like there's more going on the female side, and it's a lot more like bunched together, whereas on the male side it's kind of like less of like the red especially, and it's not so much going
Totally.
on.
Awesome, very good observation. That is what other scientists will conclude as well. And so here we could say this is a lot more cross-hemisphere connections. So across the hemisphere, there's a lot more going from left brain to right brain. But you notice here in the male brain, there's a lot more connectivity intra-hemisphere, so within one hemisphere. So one conclusion you might draw from that might be that when women go to solve a problem, it might seem chaotic or messy or confusing. And another way to write that is that they're actually drawing from a lot of different experiences, ping-ponging back and forth across the brain and across different scenarios to solve a problem in more of a continuum of a solution, versus men might be more direct. They might find one solution and go with it and move on to the next portion. And there's a lot less of that back and forth movement. So this is taken from this is the cumulative response of 33 different teenagers. So these are actually teenage brains, which is pretty cool. Yeah, any other, so what does that mean now that we know that? How might our society be set up to benefit a male brain, but not necessarily the way a female leader might conduct business? And why? And how might there be more benefit? How might there be benefits? I guess on either side. Yeah, and totally, Ezra. I'm not trying to say that humans don't use both their hemispheres. What I'm saying is that this is like lighting up different connections that were formed when faced with a problem. So the connections that happen more so of the time in the right hemisphere, connected in a male brain, and happened across both hemispheres in the right brain. But that's not to say that just one hemisphere was used, because you can see on the left there also was lighting up of these different zones as well, but they happen to connect all on one side. Does that make more sense? Cool. Awesome. So yeah, when you're thinking about like problem solving or having some sort of type of leadership, like potentially if you're widening your view, if we are widening our view and using a lot more ideas to come to a consensus or a conclusion, my hypothesis is that that might take more time, and that might take more collaboration, that might take more communication and more understanding of all points of view. And that differs a little bit from our historic way of making a decision, or oftentimes what we idolize in decision making, which is quick and fast, confident decisions that happen and give us a direction and we can move forward from there. So, yeah, and then so in this discussion, right, this kind of brings up, what does it mean then for our world to be equal, or for us to be really focusing on the ecosystem and the equality of all of that, having healthy relationships? Awesome. Yeah, sorry, Gabby, I rolled on, but this is great. Based on this, women use both logic and emotion when making a decision, but men use typically only one. And we'll talk about emotions and reactions if we have a little bit of time here coming up. But equality then, what does equality mean for you? It doesn't necessarily mean equal, it means everyone gets what they need. And this comes from a quote from one of my bosses, Catherine. She's the owner of Wild West Voyages, where I do high ropes courses. She's also a 20-year experienced teacher. And that's what she came up with. Everyone, it doesn't mean equal, it means everyone gets what they need. And so how can you use that concept in leadership? Everyone gets what they need. Can anyone think of an example there? Oh yeah, Ezra, do you want to say why? Totally. Yeah, imagine if you had the equal number of elephants as you had mosquitoes in the ecosystem. Like even just by quantity, right? We would have some volume issues. Equally, like if I mean, in a really awesome meeting, maybe everybody would share the floor in some way, or would have equal talking space. Versus one person just charging ahead, which I know seems really hypocritical because right now I'm just charging ahead and I'm like the only voice here, but we have this cool chat option, which means, but you're welcome to use your voice, and I would be happy to lend some airtime to that. Yeah, some people need more encouragement. Other people might not like the encouragement. They might feel like they're being belittled or patronized. Some people need more training. Some people just need more time to learn something. And that's something that, as a leader that is looking out for everybody's needs and understands kind of where everybody is at, that can be incredibly helpful. Okay, so, okay, yeah, so then that gets to this point, like, just because so we have figured out our vision, we've figured out our mission, we know where we're going, we know what we want to do, and then we get into our Ferrari and we just go, right? And we can go really fast and eventually, if you're this hybrid car, this is a hybrid Ferrari, which I think is kind of interesting and neat. But this needs to stop and charge up. And you might also want to stop and watch this beautiful scenery, right? So there's this quote that one of my partners always told me: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And so I think this is really big in creating a movement that can be a really awesome thing to keep reflecting on. Okay, so I might, well, let's see. Okay, let's get to this. Yeah, different types of leaders. So here's what I want you to do. You can figure out, I think this is a little bit easier framework than the authoritarian transformational. That's awesome too. But if you were to work together in a group, let's say with 4 people who were leaders, this comes from Knowles, which is an outdoor leadership. You guys can tell a lot of my examples come from outdoor leadership, which is where I have most of my my training. So if you go ahead and annotate in whatever way. So for water, I want you to answer this question, and let's see, I wrote it down below. I don't often voice strong opinions, particularly if I think it will cause hurt or be a waster of time. I put others before myself pretty consistently. I'm very flexible. You probably don't really know where I stand on issues or what I think about you, unless you ask very directly. It's hard for me to state my own needs. So if you're on that spectrum, you'd be on the left. If you're more on the wind side of things, you would say, I state my opinion and take stands easily. People know what I think, feel, and want. I'm an open book, and you don't even have to read the words because I tell them to you, especially if you try to cross one of my lines. Fight or flight, let's get real. I stay right here and tell you like it is. I don't have a problem saying my way or the highway if needed, if need be. Okay, so think about that, like where you'd be on the spectrum. I'm going to read the up and down part of it too, because once you figure out where you are on that spectrum, then you'll go up or down based on this. If you're cool as a cucumber, you're calm, rational, and do not get flustered about anything. You have difficulty getting excited about things most people think are neat and exciting. Your emotions are a glassy pond. If you're a hot tamale, you tell people how you feel about everything, you cry at sad movies, your emotions are extremely active, and the perfect storm. Okay, so go ahead and based on that water versus wind, cool cucumber, hot tamale, put yourself on this spectrum. Where would you be? Maybe you find a stand. Oh, interesting, Gabby. That's cool. I'm definitely over here. Yeah, let's say you somewhere in the middle. So where are you more so though? Are you more so going to tell people what you think, or are you more so going to allow the flow to happen and kind of be going with the most harmonious option? It's hard. Every time you dichotomize something, it becomes interesting in my opinion. Like either or, because sometimes it's a mix of a lot. You can't be in the middle. You gotta choose. More so in, yeah, okay, cool. And that doesn't mean that at any time, right? Just same with the personality test, you might not, you might fluctuate into different styles or different types of leadership. Okay, cool. And you can go back and look at this PowerPoint. I think I'm going to skip through some of these, but it's neat to know if you're building a team, having all 4 of these people represented can be awesome balance. Okay, so we looked at the landscape of a couple leaders. We looked at different leadership styles, and let's go into our discussion on right and wrong and integrity, and we'll probably get to that, and we'll go into the restoration part of it next week. But here's some words that came up when you guys were answering these ethical questions. How do we know what is right and wrong? A lot of you mentioned professionalism, honesty, boundaries, transparency. A conversation with a couple friends here brought up these points. Ethical leadership has to do with space. Everyone needs space to breathe, to be themselves, respecting someone else's space. That was a big concept for my one particular friend when we were talking about ethical leadership. And another friend mentioned this, ethics are the duty to abide by a set of contracts set out by your community so that everyone feels respected. And in that way, you might be able to see that ethics there's a blurred line, right? Like there's this continuum or potentially a gray zone of what it means to be ethical. And that kind of gets to this idea of integrity. So this example comes from Minneapolis. This is the I-35 bridge that collapsed about 14 years ago, I think, at this point. They have since rebuilt it. 13 people died. I think there were school buses on here. It was a real big tragedy. But when we have a loss of integrity or when our ethics are in question, we oftentimes have some sort of collapse that can happen. And in that way, we might have a fire that happens, and we need to come together with some ability to restore or approach this conflict. And so there's this idea within servant leadership of like, what type of conflict style are you? So geese collaborate, ostriches avoid, as in putting their heads to the ground. Doves accommodate, think of a dove going whoo, whoo, whoo. Hawks compete or manipulate, threaten, attack those who disagree with them. And then owls compromise or seek fair and peaceful solutions. So go ahead and put a stamp next to one of these conflict styles. Which do you think you fall into? Awesome. Yeah, and I'll say it's cool to know like, okay, we're ultimately going for an owl's version of compromise, but none of us are perfect, right? Maybe like this is actually a picture I took of this little goose, which is cool. And it was fun because I had a bunch of friends actually. It was sometimes I just go on hikes with one friend, but this was multiple friends. We all went out together, so it was cool to see this goose at the same time. But ostriches avoid, I mean, I had a conflict with someone this week, and although I knew about this and I wanted to accommodate and collaborate and compromise, what I ended up doing was to be an ostrich, and I avoided. And although that's really hard to recognize, it's part of being human. And so there is some restoration that's possible. We'll go into this more next week. And I'll give you some more toolkits for getting to what we call above the line. So getting to places where we're feeling in trust and responsible. We're able to create and love, forgive, have faith, and wonder. We're about to get cut off here, so look for an announcement from me for further direction. But otherwise, good job in the course, and I hope you got something out of this live lesson. It was good to see all of you guys. Make sure to schedule your DBAs if you haven't already. So, bye. A minute is long when you just let it go. I'm always nervous, but here we are.